Hey, so I want to talk a little bit about Eucharist. Um, I talk about it sometimes on here, Eucharist, communion. It looks different in different communities, but it's a Christian practice of sharing bread and a drink, sometimes water, sometimes wine, sometimes water mixed with wine. Um, and it's a ritual that has different meanings for different people in different communities and is acted out in different ways in different communities. And some people are just not familiar with it at all, and it's looked really different over time. So I thought we would talk about that. I just wanted to give you a little short history of the Eucharist, which maybe is profoundly boring to you, or maybe is a little bit interesting because I think sometimes things in church are just sort of taken for granted, and so we either really don't know anything about them or we just make assumptions about them and then find out what, that's totally wrong. We have this idea in our head about what it's looked like over time, about what it means, and sometimes that idea doesn't necessarily match up with the actuality of history and of the ways that people have gone about Eucharist in the past. So, a short history of the Eucharist. So, Christ's presence in the Eucharist has been seen very differently at different points in history. While early Christian communities varied widely and evidence of their practices are few, the Didache is a piece that we can go to. It's a first or second century catechism. That means it's like a guide for learners. I think if you're a Catholic, you might know what catechism is. It's like classes before becoming, it's classes about the faith. So the Didache is something like that. It's sort of instructions, rules for people coming into the community. And so there's this thing called the Didache, and it's from the first or second century, and it uses Trinitarian language around the Eucharist and references a mystical union of all believers, and it parallels the Christians with grains of wheat scattered on the mountains. They use the prayer from the Last Supper, and while there is mysticism in their discussion of communion in this document, there's no sense that Christ is in any way physically present in the Eucharist. It seems more that the meal remembers Christ and draws people into community through time and space. As the Roman Catholic Church centralized and began to develop orthodoxy, the concept of, and I'm calling it the Roman Catholic Church, but at different points that organization also encompassed what became Protestantism, what became Orthodoxy, what became a lot of other traditions. So I think that's important to remember because while the branches, the splintering happened at different points in time, but yes. So as it began to centralize, there's kind of a coming like this and then a going like this as the church began to come together and try and unify, and then started to also split at different points in history. So, as the Roman Catholic Church, as I'm calling it, centralized and began to develop orthodoxy, the concept of transubstantiation was elevated to the orthodox position. And that the transubstantiation meant that the bread and wine were ritually transformed via language and gesture performed by the priests into the literal body and blood of Christ. And I know some of us like to throw around the word literally today in a way that doesn't actually, that means like figuratively. But that means that people really believed that when you did the ritual the right way around that bread and wine, it became physically the body and blood of Christ that we would eat. Um, while this framework dominated for many years, the Protestant Reformation led to a reimagination of the Eucharist as a symbol or as an act of remembrance. So for reformers, transubstantiation just didn't make sense. For people like Zwingli, who was one of the people who was involved in the Protestant Reformation as a leader, if Jesus did not mean the bread and the body, the bread and wine were body and blood at the Last Supper, like if when he said, "This is my body, this is my blood," that night he didn't mean that. His body and his blood were still intact, and he was handling physical bread and wine. So if he didn't mean it literally then, which he decided that Jesus could not have since he was physically present, including his body and blood, that it was no more literal in our practice of it today. So transubstantiation for Zwingli, so reformers countered dominant theology of their time in many ways. And as we can see from that early document that I mentioned, the Didache, it's possible that may have looked, that what Zwingli and others in the Protestant Reformation were pushing for in terms of Eucharist could actually be considered more like, or at least, more like what some Christians were doing very, very early in the Christian movement. The frequency of communion has also changed over time, with different groups partaking in communion to varying degrees of frequency today. So evidence from the Didache, which is an early document, as we talked about earlier, the first apology of Justin, the apostolic tradition, and the pilgrimage of Egeria, these are all very early documents that happened in the early centuries of the Christian movement. Communion was central to early Christian worship practices. So in all of these documents, it's clear that communion is a really important part of what Christians are doing together. As a church, it's probable that early Christians took communion at every worship gathering. As the church grew, an absence of clergy led to infrequent communion, often only annually, once a year. And in the medieval church, communion was ocular for laity and only partaken of physically by the priests. So that means the priests did their ritual and they ate the bread and the wine, and everybody else in the congregation just looked. And they called that ocular communion. So you were still a participant in a sense. If you're familiar with the idea of darshan, maybe that makes a little bit more sense. Or maybe that can help you tie some similarities between traditions together. But people didn't actually eat the bread and wine at that time. They were participating by looking. That might show you or suggest to you a little bit of how people believe participation works in hierarchic systems. Anyway, these practices, however, were reversed after Vatican II. So in the 60s, Vatican II required active participation of the laity in communion. And the Roman Catholic Church now practices Eucharist weekly with the entire congregation, and sometimes more than weekly. In Protestant churches, despite prominent reformers' objections, communion became less frequent. The minimum requirements of annual communion often became the norm. Especially in frontier and revival environments in the Americas, there was often a lack of ordained clergy, and that meant that no one could properly consecrate the Eucharist. Sorry. Got a tickle. Because of this, not because of the tickle, because of the lack of clergy, Communion was less frequent, and communities began to promote elders and other non-ordained clergy to having the ability to consecrate the Eucharist. In today's Protestant churches, there is variance. Many churches practice communion monthly or quarterly, although some churches partake annually or weekly. Those individuals deemed acceptable to preside over the Eucharist have similarly changed over time. Evidence from archaeological work suggests that women were once seen fit to preside over the Eucharist in the early centuries of the Christian movement. The early church lacked hierarchical organization in its beginnings, so ordained clergy didn't really exist. There wasn't this super formalized ritual over deciding who became like a person of power or the person who had the rights to do certain practices. So the Eucharist was likely a shared act. Early on, as churches grew, elected positions were created to help communities run more smoothly. And we see this in churches today too. Like a smaller church will have fewer staff members than a larger church. Once you get bigger, you just need people to help organize and, rent chairs and, whatever. And back then it wasn't that, but it was, the communities needed to be organized. And so positions needed to be created in order to help facilitate that. So presidents and deacons were elected to serve Eucharist. The Roman Catholic Church would decide that the consecration of Eucharist must be performed in precise ways, and Gregorian reforms included specific instructions for Eucharist. As I mentioned before, in frontier and revival traditions, there was often a lack of ordained clergy. Thus, church elders were elevated to positions allowing them to preside over the Eucharist. So it didn't need to necessarily be the priest. And in some cases, communities took power into their own hands and performed the rituals themselves. Most contemporary churches require ordained clergy to preside over the Eucharist, but not all of them. In addition to the physical aspects of communion, communion has been understood through different metaphorical lenses as well. From evidence of the earliest Christian communities, Eucharist has been seen as a part of an act of thanksgiving. In many early communities, the Eucharist was part of a full meal and a celebration and thanksgiving of the abundance provided by God and communal Christian living. Prayers of thanks were part of the language surrounding communion in the Didache, the earliest extant Christian catechism. Prayers of gratitude have been part of meals since before Christianity was distinct from Judaism. In a world where many go hungry and many have abundance, we can be thankful for the physical food of communion as well as the spiritual nourishment that accompanies it. Gratitude for the gifts of God can and should be pervasive in worship. The Eucharist is also a commemoration of the Last Supper. Before his execution, Jesus shared a Passover meal with his disciples. Sharing bread and wine are reportedly offering the metaphor of bread and body. Christians remember Jesus and his death and resurrection through partaking in this meal that Jesus was supposed to have participated in. In so, remembering the death and resurrection, we are reminded of the salvific nature of those acts, and partaking in communion can remind us of the salvific acts of Christ and salvation through and in him. We remember his ministry that ended, in many ways, with that meal. The eating of Eucharist honors the memory of Christ and the type of relationship he fostered with his followers. Eucharist is also communion. It draws us together in the body of Christ. In partaking of communion, we act as a community sharing a meal and acknowledge the familial nature of that act. We also share a meal with all Christians who have come and gone before us, or who still live in other areas of the world. We are drawn together through time and space in the mysticism of a shared act. We draw ourselves into relationship with God and Jesus, partaking of the meal with them as well. Emphasizing theologies of community helps to offer a place in the world as well as the cosmos, and offers ways to view both personal and community relationships. Eucharist is a shared act that we become part of as we partake in it. Eucharist and the theologies and practices surrounding it have changed and evolved over time. People throughout time in the Christian movement have tried to understand Jesus' relationship and presence in the meal, and have varied in how frequently the Eucharist was shared. Sometimes the frequency of the Eucharist was dependent upon who was able to preside over it, and people's roles in presiding over the Eucharist have changed over time. We can understand Eucharist as an act of thanksgiving for the gifts from God and the gift of salvation. Our salvation is remembered in commemorating the Last Supper and remembering the meal Christ shared with his followers before his execution and resurrection. Finally, Eucharist draws us into a community of believers throughout time and space. We participate in the whole body of Christ and are participants in his work together. The Eucharist and its meanings are multivalent, offering meaning and interpretations to people in different ways throughout history. So yeah, do you have questions about Eucharist or other traditions of church or religion? And what does Eucharist mean to you if you practice it? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's practiced differently too. In my home church, we practice it once a month, and it's usually bread like a French bread, but sometimes it's different. And it's cut up into like little pieces, and we dip it in grape juice and eat it. Maybe you do it differently. Okay. So that's about Eucharist. So now you're like super educated and you can go school people on Eucharist. Okay.